Racist cops unjustly arrest black family. But when the truth came out, the entire town was shaken to its core. The warm summer breeze rustled through the leaves of the old oak tree that stood sentinel in front of the Johnson family home. It was a picturesque Sunday morning in the quiet suburb of Millbrook, the kind of day that promised nothing but peace and tranquility. Little did the Johnsons know that this day would change their lives forever. Samuel Johnson, a respected high school history teacher, stood at the kitchen window, sipping his morning coffee. His eyes crinkled with joy as he watched his wife, Evelyn, tending to her prized rose garden. Their two children, 16-year-old Marcus and 12-year-old Zoe, were engrossed in a spirited game of basketball on the driveway. "Honey," Samuel called out to Evelyn, "don't forget we're meeting the Taylors for lunch at 1 p.m. Evelyn looked up from her roses, wiping a bead of sweat from her brow. "I remember, dear. I've got the salad chilling in the fridge." The Johnsons had lived in Millbrook for over 2 decades. They were well known and loved in the community, always ready to lend a helping hand or contribute to local charities. Samuel's passionate teaching had inspired countless students, while Evelyn's work as a pediatric nurse at the local hospital had touched many lives. As the clock struck noon, the family began to prepare for their lunch engagement. Marcus and Zoe reluctantly ended their game, heading inside to get cleaned up. Samuel straightened his tie in the hallway mirror, while Evelyn put the finishing touches on her homemade potato salad. "Everyone ready?" Samuel asked, jingling his car keys. The family piled into their sensible sedan, with Marcus calling shotgun and Zoe grumbling good-naturedly about always being stuck in the back. As they pulled out of the driveway, none of them noticed the police cruiser slowly making its way down their street. The drive to the Taylors' house was short and pleasant, filled with easy conversation and laughter. The Taylors, an elderly couple who had been pillars of the community for half a century, greeted the Johnsons warmly at the door. "Samuel, Evelyn, and look how big the kids have gotten," Margaret Taylor exclaimed, enveloping each of them in a hug. The afternoon passed in a blur of good food, better company, and stories that had everyone in stitches. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, the Johnsons bid their farewells and headed home, their hearts full and spirits high. It was just past 7 p.m. when they turned onto their street. The first sign that something was amiss was the cluster of police cars parked haphazardly in front of their house, their lights painting the quiet neighborhood in alternating flashes of red and blue. "What on earth?" Samuel muttered, slowing the car to a crawl. As they approached their driveway, a stern-faced officer stepped into the street, holding up a hand to stop them. Samuel complied, rolling down his window with a mixture of confusion and concern etched on his face. "Is everything all right, officer?" he asked politely. The officer's hand moved to rest on his holstered weapon, a gesture that sent a chill down Samuel's spine. "Step out of the vehicle, all of you. Hands where I can see them." Bewildered and increasingly alarmed, the Johnson family complied. As they exited the car, more officers approached, their hands on their weapons. "What's going on?" Evelyn asked, her voice trembling slightly as she placed a protective hand on Zoe's shoulder. "We received a report of a break-in at this address," one of the officers stated flatly. "You match the description of the suspect." Samuel's brow furrowed in disbelief. "Break-in? This is our home. We've lived here for over 20 years. There must be some mistake." But his words fell on deaf ears. In a whirlwind of shouted commands and rough hands, the Johnson family found themselves being handcuffed and read their rights. Neighbors began to emerge from their homes, watching in shock as the respected family was treated like common criminals. "Please, you're frightening my children," Evelyn pleaded, tears streaming down her face as she watched Zoe sobbing and Marcus struggling to maintain his composure. The officers remained unmoved, their faces masks of indifference as they began to search the Johnsons their car and pat them down. The once peaceful street now echoed with the sounds of radio chatter and the distressed cries of the Johnson children. As Samuel was being led to a police cruiser, he locked eyes with his elderly neighbor, Mr. Grayson, who stood on his porch with a look of utter disbelief. "Call our lawyer," Samuel managed to shout before being roughly shoved into the back of the car. The door slammed shut, and the Johnsons found themselves separated, confused, and terrified. As the police cruisers pulled away from their home, leaving behind a stunned neighborhood, the Johnsons couldn't help but wonder. How could this happen? What went wrong? And most importantly, what would happen next? Little did they know, this unjust arrest was just the beginning of a harrowing journey that would not only test their family's strength, but also shine a glaring light on the deep-seated issues of racial profiling and police misconduct that had long simmered beneath the surface of their seemingly idyllic community. As the police station loomed ahead, the Johnsons steeled themselves for the fight of their lives. A fight for justice, their reputation, and for the very future of their family. The harsh fluorescent lights of the Millbrook police station buzzed overhead as the Johnson family was led through a maze of corridors. The smell of industrial cleaner and stale coffee permeated the air, a stark contrast to the warm, homey scent of the lunch they had enjoyed just hours ago. Samuel, Evelyn, Marcus, and Zoe were separated and taken to different interrogation rooms. The cold metal chairs and bare walls seemed to close in on them as they waited, confused and frightened, for someone to explain what was happening. In his room, Samuel sat with his back straight, years of facing unruly students helping him maintain a calm exterior despite the turmoil within. When the door finally opened, two detectives entered, one older with graying hair and a weathered face, the other younger with a notebook in hand. "Mr. Johnson," the older detective began, his voice gruff. "I'm Detective Brooks, and this is Detective Ramirez. Do you know why you're here?" Samuel leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. "No, sir, I don't. There's been a terrible mistake. We were just returning home from lunch with friends when—" "A likely story," Detective Brooks interrupted. "We have eyewitness reports of 4 individuals matching your family's description breaking into the house at 1242 Maple Street. That's your address, isn't it?" "Yes, but—" "And where were you between the hours of 12 p.m. and 7 p.m. today?" Samuel took a deep breath, fighting to keep his voice steady. "As I was trying to explain, we were at the home of Margaret and Harold Taylor. They're respected members of the community. You can call them to verify our whereabouts." In another room, Evelyn was facing her own interrogation. Unlike Samuel, she couldn't hold back her tears as she thought of her children, especially young Zoe, alone and scared. "Mrs. Johnson," female detective said, her tone softer but no less probing, "can you explain why your neighbors reported seeing suspicious activity at your house while you claim to have been away?" Evelyn shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't understand. We've lived in that house for over 20 years. Our neighbors know us. Who would report such a thing?" Meanwhile, Marcus sat in stoic silence, his mind racing. As a young black man, he had been warned about situations like this, but he never thought it would happen to his family. When the detectives tried to question him, he remembered his father's advice. Stay calm, be respectful, but don't say anything without a lawyer present. Zoe, however, was inconsolable. 12-year-old girl sobbed uncontrollably, asking repeatedly for her parents. The sight of the distraught child gave even the most hardened officers pause, but protocol demanded they continue their investigation. As the night wore on, word of the Johnsons' arrest spread through Millbrook like wildfire. Mr. Grayson, true to his word, had immediately contacted the family's lawyer, Patricia Simmons. Fierce advocate for civil rights, Patricia arrived at the station like a force of nature, demanding to see her clients. "This is an outrage," she declared to the desk sergeant. "The Johnsons are upstanding members of this community. I want to see them immediately, and I want to know on what grounds they're being held." While Patricia fought to gain access to the family, the Millbrook community was in an uproar. Social media exploded with posts about the incident, many expressing disbelief and outrage at the treatment of the well-loved family. Reverend Michael Turner of the First Baptist Church, where the Johnsons were active members, began organizing a prayer vigil outside the police station. "We cannot stand idly by while injustice occurs in our own backyard," he announced to his congregation. Quickly spread the word. By midnight, a crowd had gathered outside the station. Candles flickered in the darkness as community members held signs reading, "Free the Johnsons," and "Stop racial profiling." The local news stations arrived, their cameras capturing the growing unrest. Inside the station, the mood was tense. The detectives were beginning to realize that their case wasn't as clear-cut as they had initially believed. The Taylors had indeed confirmed the Johnsons' alibi, and a search of the Johnson home had turned up no evidence of a break-in or any stolen property. Detective Ramirez, the younger of the two interrogating Samuel, pulled his partner aside. "Brooks, something's not adding up here. Their story checks out, and we've got nothing concrete to hold them on." Brooks, however, was reluctant to admit a mistake. "We can't just let them go. What about the eyewitness report?" As the detectives argued, Tricia Simmons finally gained access to her client. She moved swiftly from room to room, advising each family member of their rights and reassuring them that she would get to the bottom of this. When she reached Samuel, she found him with his head in his hands, the weight of the situation finally breaking through his composed facade. "Patricia," he said, looking up with red-rimmed eyes, "what's happening? How could this happen to us?" Patricia placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "I don't know, Samuel, but I promise you we're going to fight this. Community is behind you. There's a crowd outside right now, demanding your release." As dawn broke over Millbrook, casting a pale light through the station windows, pressure on the police department was mounting. The chief of police, awakened by calls from the mayor and other city officials, arrived to assess the situation. After a heated discussion with the detectives and a review of the evidence, or lack thereof, the chief made a decision. "Release them," he ordered, his face grim. "But this isn't over. We still have an eyewitness report to contend with." One by one, the Johnsons were released from their holding cells. They reunited in the station lobby, embracing each other with a mixture of relief and lingering fear. As Patricia led them out of the station, they were greeted by a sea of familiar faces. Friends, neighbors, and community members who had stood vigil through the night. Crowd erupted in cheers as the family emerged, but Samuel could see the flashing cameras of news crews and hear the shouted questions from reporters. He knew that while this ordeal was over for now, their fight was far from finished. As they made their way through the crowd, accepting hugs and words of support, Samuel turned to Patricia. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice heavy with exhaustion and concern. Patricia's eyes flashed with determination. "Now, we find out who made that false report and why. And we make sure this never happens to another family in Millbrook again." The Johnsons climbed into Patricia's car, the events of the past 24 hours swirling in their minds. As they drove away from the station, leaving behind the cheering crowd and probing cameras, they knew their lives would never be the same. The fight for justice was just beginning, and it would take every ounce of their strength and the support of their community to see it through. Little did they know, the shocking revelations that awaited them would shake their town to its very core. The days following the Johnsons' release from police custody were a whirlwind of activity. Their home became a hub of community support, with neighbors dropping off meals, offering words of encouragement, and even helping to field the constant barrage of media inquiry. Samuel and Evelyn, despite their exhaustion, knew they couldn't simply return to their normal lives. There were too many unanswered questions, too much at stake. With Patricia Simmons' guidance, they decided to take action. "We need to find out who made that false report," Tricia said during a strategy meeting in the Johnsons' living room. "That's the key to understanding why this happened." Marcus, who had been quieter than usual since their ordeal, spoke up. "I've been thinking about that. What if we could get access to the 911 call?" Patricia nodded approvingly. "Good thinking, Marcus. I've already filed a request for the recording under the Freedom of Information Act. We should have it within a few days." Meanwhile, the incident had sparked a broader conversation in Millbrook about racial profiling and police practices. Town council called an emergency meeting to address the community's concerns. The meeting hall was packed, with citizens spilling out onto the street. Mayor Eleanor Thompson, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s, opened the meeting with a somber address. "What happened to the Johnson family is unacceptable," she declared. "We must examine our practices and biases to ensure this never happens again." Police Chief Robert Hawkins, looking uncomfortable in his dress uniform, took the podium next. "We are conducting a thorough internal investigation into the incident," he assured the crowd. "If any officer is found to have acted improperly, they will face consequences." But for many in attendance, these words rang hollow. Reverend Turner stood up, his voice ringing out clear and strong. "Chief Hawkins, with all due respect, we need more than an internal investigation. We need transparency and accountability." As the meeting continued, heated debates erupted about racial bias in policing, the need for better training, and the importance of community oversight. The Johnsons, sitting quietly in the back of the hall, felt a mix of emotions as they listened to their neighbors argue about the issues that had so personally affected them. Back at the police station, Detectives Brooks and Ramirez were feeling the heat. Their superiors were demanding answers, and the pressure to solve the case was mounting. "We need to track down that eyewitness," Brooks growled, poring over their case notes for the 100th time. "They're the only one who can corroborate the 911 call." Ramirez nodded, but a nagging doubt had been growing in his mind. "Brooks, have you considered the possibility that there was no break-in? That this whole thing might have been a false alarm or something worse?" Brooks shot him a sharp look. "What are you suggesting, Ramirez?" "I'm not suggesting anything," Ramirez said carefully. "I'm just saying we need to consider all possibilities." As the detectives continued their investigation, Patricia received the 911 recording. She invited the Johnsons to her office to listen to it together. The family sat in tense silence as Patricia played the audio. A man's voice, slightly distorted but clearly agitated, came through the speakers. "Yeah, I want to report a break-in. 1242 Maple Street. I see 4 people forcing their way in. They look like they don't belong in this neighborhood, if you know what I mean." Samuel's fists clenched as he recognized the thinly veiled racial undertones in the caller's words. Evelyn gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. Marcus and Zoe exchanged worried glances. Patricia leaned forward, brow furrowed in concentration. "There's something familiar about that voice," she mused. "Can't quite place it, but I've heard it before." As they discussed the call, trying to identify the voice or any other clues, Patricia's assistant burst into the room, waving a printout. "You need to see this," she said breathlessly, handing the paper to Patricia. Patricia's eyes widened as she read the document. "This is a report from a private investigator I hired to look into similar incidents in neighboring towns," she explained to the Johnsons. "Apparently, there's been a string of false reports targeting minority families across the county, all made by different callers, but with eerily similar language and outcome." The implications of this revelation hung heavy in the air. Could the incident with the Johnsons be part of a larger, coordinated effort to harass minority families? As they grappled with this disturbing possibility, across town, a man sat in his dimly lit study, nervously watching the local news coverage of the Johnson case. His hands shook slightly as he reached for his phone, dialing a number from memory. "It's me," he said in a low voice when the call was answered. "We need to talk. Things are getting out of hand." The voice on the other end was cold and authoritative. "Calm down. Stick to the plan. This will all blow over soon enough." But as the man hung up, he couldn't shake the feeling that their carefully constructed scheme was beginning to unravel. Back at the Johnson home, family was trying to process the new information. Samuel paced the living room, his teacher's mind working to connect the dots. "If this is happening in other towns, it can't be a coincidence," he reasoned. "There has to be a pattern, a motive." Evelyn, always the pragmatist, asked the question they were all thinking. "But why? Why would anyone want to do this to us, to other families?" As they debated possible explanations, from simple racism to more complex conspiracies, Zoe, who had been quietly listening, suddenly spoke up. "Dad, remember when you were pushing for that new curriculum at school? The one about African American history?" Samuel paused, looking at his daughter with surprise. "Yes, but what does that have to do with this?" Zoe continued, her voice growing more confident. "Well, didn't some people get really angry about it? There were those meetings where people yelled a lot, and you got those nasty emails." A light of recognition dawned in Samuel's eye. "You're right, Zoe. There was a group that strongly opposed the curriculum change. They said it was, did they call it, divisive propaganda?" Marcus jumped in, excitement in his voice. I remember that. They called themselves the Heritage Preservation Society, or something like that. Tricia, who had been listening intently, quickly jotted down notes. This could be the connection we're looking for, she said. This group exists in other towns too. It might explain the pattern of false reports. As the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, the Johnsons felt a mix of hope and apprehension. They were getting closer to the truth. But what would that truth reveal? And more importantly, how deep did this conspiracy go? Little did they know, their investigation was about to uncover a web of deceit stretched far beyond their quiet suburban town, involving powerful figures who would stop at nothing, maintain the status quo. As night fell over Millbrook, the Johnsons and Patricia prepared to delve deeper into their investigation, unaware that their every move was being watched by those who had orchestrated their ordeal. The stage was set for a confrontation that would not only change their lives, but potentially reshape the very fabric of their community. Following weeks were a flurry of activity for the Johnsons and their growing team of supporters. Patricia Simmons had enlisted the help of investigative journalist Samantha Chen, known for her hard-hitting exposés on corruption and social injustice. Together, they began to dig deeper into the connections between the false police reports and the mysterious Heritage Preservation Society. Samantha's research uncovered a disturbing pattern. The Heritage Preservation Society, or HPS, had chapters in several towns across the state, each coinciding with incidents of false reports against minority families. It's like they're testing the waters, Samantha explained during a strategy meeting in Patricia's office, seeing how far they can push before someone pushes back. As they delved deeper, they discovered that the HPS was more than just a fringe group of concerned citizens. Its membership included several prominent figures in local politics, law enforcement, and business. The organization's stated goal of preserving traditional values masked a darker agenda of maintaining racial and economic segregation in their community. Meanwhile, Marcus had taken it upon himself to rally his peers. He organized a student group at his high school dedicated to raising awareness about racial profiling and police accountability. Their peaceful protests and social media campaigns caught the attention of national civil rights organizations, bringing even more scrutiny to Millbrook's police department. Zoe, not to be outdone by her older brother, used her artistic talents to create powerful posters and murals depicting her family's experience. Her work became a symbol of the movement, shared widely online and displayed prominently throughout the town. As public pressure mounted, cracks began to appear in the facade of those involved in the conspiracy. Detective Ramirez, racked with guilt over his role in the Johnsons' arrest, approached Chief Hawkins with his suspicions about the case. "Chief, I think we were set up," Ramirez said, his voice low as he closed the office door behind him. "The 911 call, the eyewitness report, it all feels too convenient." Hawkins leaned back in his chair, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. "Ramirez, do you understand what you're implying? If what you're saying is true, it could bring down half the department." "I know, sir," Ramirez replied, steeling himself. "But isn't that better than continuing to be part of the problem?" As Ramirez left the chief's office, neither man noticed the figure lurking in the shadows of the hallway, listening intently to their conversation. Across town, in the opulent study of Judge William Blackwell, a clandestine meeting of the HPS leadership was taking place. The judge, founding member of the society, addressed the group with barely contained anger. "Gentlemen, we have a situation on our hands," growled. "This Johnson family is causing more trouble than we anticipated. They're not backing down and they're gaining support." City Councilman George Hartley, his face flushed with anxiety, spoke up. "We need to discredit them somehow. Plant evidence, spread rumors, anything to take the focus off us." But Mayor Thompson, who had been quietly observing until now, shook her head. "No, we've gone too far already. It's time to cut our losses and distance ourselves from this mess." As the argument heated up, none of them realized that their entire conversation was being recorded by a hidden device, planted by an unexpected ally in their midst. Back at the Johnson home, Samuel and Evelyn were preparing for a televised interview with a national news network. As they sat in their living room, surrounded by lights and cameras, the weight of their responsibility settled on their shoulders. "Mr. and Mrs. Johnson," the interviewer began, "your case has sparked a national conversation about racial profiling and police misconduct. What do you hope will come from sharing your story?" Samuel took a deep breath before answering. "We hope that our experience will open people's eyes to the reality that many families like ours face every day. This isn't just about us. It's about creating a just and equitable society for everyone." Evelyn nodded in agreement. "We also want to emphasize that this isn't about vilifying all police officers. Many are dedicated public servants. This is about addressing systemic issues and holding those who abuse their power accountable." As the interview aired, it sent shockwaves through the community. For many, seeing the Johnsons, their neighbors, colleagues, and friends, speak so eloquently about their ordeal brought the issues into sharp focus. The next day, as Samuel arrived at the high school where he taught, he was greeted by a sea of students wearing T-shirts, emblazoned with the words, "Stand with the Johnson." The sight brought tears to his eyes, a reminder of the impact their fight was having on the younger generation. But not everyone was supportive. As the investigation progressed, the Johnsons began receiving threatening letters and phone calls. Hateful graffiti appeared on their garage door one morning. Despite the police department's assurances that they were taking these incidents seriously, the family couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Patricia, concerned for their safety, hired a private security firm to protect the family. "We can't take any chances," she insisted. "You've rattled some powerful cages, and we don't know how desperate they might become." As tensions in the town reached a boiling point, Samantha Chen received an anonymous tip that would blow the case wide open. Flash drive, delivered to her office by an unidentified courier, contained financial records linking the HPS to a network of shell companies used to funnel money into local elections and police department budgets. "This is it," Samantha said breathlessly as she shared the information with Patricia and the Johnson. "This proves that the HPS has been manipulating the system for years, influencing policies and law enforcement practices to maintain their vision of a traditional community." With this new evidence in hand, Patricia prepared to take legal action. She filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against the police department, HPS, and several key individuals implicated in the conspiracy. The news of the lawsuit sent shockwaves through Millbrook's power structures. Judge Blackwell, realizing the gravity of the situation, made a desperate phone call to Mayor Thompson. "Eleanor, we need to contain this," he hissed into the phone. "Use your influence, call in favors. We can't let this go to trial." But Mayor Thompson had reached her breaking point. "I'm sorry, William," she said firmly. "I can't be part of this any longer. It's time for the truth to come out." As the mayor hung up the phone, she turned to face the person sitting across from her desk, Detective Ramirez. "Are you ready to make your statement?" she asked. Ramirez nodded solemnly. "Yes, Madam Mayor, it's time to do the right thing." As news of the lawsuit and the emerging evidence spread, the town of Millbrook found itself at the center of a national media frenzy. Reporters descended on the quiet suburb, eager to uncover every detail of the unfolding scandal. The Johnsons, thrust into the spotlight as reluctant heroes, struggled to maintain their normal lives amidst the chaos. But they drew strength from each other and from the growing movement they had inspired. As they prepared for the legal battle ahead, Samuel gathered his family in their living room, away from the prying eyes of the media camped outside. "No matter what happens," he said, looking each of them in the eye, "we're in this together. Our fight isn't just for us anymore. It's for every family who's ever faced injustice. We have to see this through." Evelyn squeezed his hand while Marcus and Zoe nodded solemnly. They knew that the road ahead would be challenging, but they were ready to face whatever came their way. Little did they know, the most shocking revelations were yet to come, and the true extent of the conspiracy was about to be laid bare for all to see. The federal courthouse in downtown Millbrook never seen such activity. As the civil rights lawsuit filed by the Johnsons went to trial, the normally quiet building buzzed with tension and anticipation. News vans lined the streets, their satellite dishes reaching skyward like metallic trees. Inside the courtroom, Patricia Simmons stood before the jury, her voice resonating with conviction as she delivered her opening statement. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about more than just one family's ordeal. It's about a systemic abuse of power that has corrupted the very institutions meant to protect and serve our community. As the trial progressed, a parade of witnesses took the stand. Detective Ramirez, true to his word, testified about the pressure within the police department to target certain neighborhoods and individuals. His testimony sent shockwaves through the courtroom and led to the immediate suspension of several high-ranking officers, including Chief Hawkins. Mayor Thompson's testimony proved to be a turning point. With quiet dignity, she detailed her gradual realization of the depth of corruption within the town's leadership and her decision to come forward. "I couldn't stay silent any longer," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "The people of Millbrook deserved better." But perhaps the most damning testimony came from an unexpected source. George Hartley, the city councilman who had suggested discrediting the Johnsons, cracked under the pressure of cross-examination. In a moment of panic, he blurted out details of secret meetings, offshore accounts, and a years-long conspiracy to maintain racial and economic segregation in Millbrook and surrounding towns. As the evidence mounted, Judge William Blackwell and other key figures in the Heritage Preservation Society saw their carefully constructed world crumbling around them. Some attempted to flee, only to be apprehended by federal agents who had been quietly building their own case based on Samantha Chen's investigative work. Throughout the trial, the Johnsons sat in the courtroom, listening to testimony after testimony. They held hands during particularly difficult moments, drawing strength from each other and from the community members who packed the public gallery in a show of support. Outside the courthouse, the scene was equally dramatic. Protesters gathered daily, holding signs demanding justice and reform. Counter-protesters, though smaller in number, also made their presence known, highlighting the deep divisions that still existed in the community. As the trial neared its conclusion, Samuel was called to the stand. Looking out over the courtroom, he saw faces filled with anger, shame, hope, and determination. He took a deep breath and began to speak. "What happened to my family was not just an isolated incident," he said, voice steady and clear. "It was a symptom of a larger problem that has festered in the shadows for far too long. But today, we have an opportunity to bring it into the light and begin the hard work of healing and change." His testimony moved many in the courtroom to tears, including some of the jurors. Even some of the defendants seemed affected, their faces etched with a mixture of regret and resignation. After weeks of testimony and mountains of evidence, the jury reached their verdict. As the forewoman stood to read it, a hush fell over the courtroom. "In the matter of Johnson et al. Versus Millbrook Police Department et al., we find in favor of the plaintiffs," she announced. Courtroom erupted in cheers and sobs of relief. The judge's gavel came down hard, restoring order. He proceeded to outline a series of sweeping reforms for the police department and local government, including independent oversight, mandatory bias training, and a complete overhaul of hiring and promotion practices. As the Johnsons emerged from the courthouse, they were greeted by a sea of supporters. Reverend Turner stepped forward, embracing each family member. "You've done more than win a lawsuit," said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've given us all hope for a better future." In the days and weeks that followed, the impact of the trial rippled out far beyond Millbrook. Similar lawsuits were filed in other towns where the HPS had operated. State and federal investigations were launched into police practices and corrupt local governments across the country. The Johnsons, though relieved that justice had been served, knew that their work was far from over. They used the platform they had gained to advocate for broader reforms and to support other families who had faced similar injustices. Samuel returned to his classroom with a renewed sense of purpose, incorporating lessons about civil rights, civic responsibility, and the power of perseverance into his curriculum. Evelyn, drawing on her experiences, started a support group for families dealing with trauma from police encounters. Marcus, inspired by the lawyers and activists he had met during the trial, decided to pursue a career in civil rights law. Zoe continued to use her art to raise awareness, Her work now featured in galleries and social justice campaigns across the country. As life in Millbrook slowly returned to a new normal, the town began the difficult process of reconciliation and rebuilding. The Heritage Preservation Society was disbanded, assets seized and redistributed to community development programs. New leaders emerged, committed to creating a more inclusive and equitable community. 1 year after the trial, the Johnsons stood on the steps of the newly renovated Millbrook Community Center. A diverse crowd had gathered for the unveiling of a mural commissioned to commemorate the town's journey. As the covering fell away, gasps of appreciation rose from the crowd. The mural depicted scenes from Millbrook's history, both the painful moments and the triumphs. At its center were the Johnsons, surrounded by a diverse group of community members, all reaching toward a brighter future. As Samuel looked out over the crowd, he saw faces of all colors, ages, and backgrounds. He saw former adversaries standing side by side with longtime allies. He saw a community forever changed, but stronger, for having faced its demons. "This isn't the end of our story," he said, addressing the gathered crowd. "It's a new beginning. We've shown what's possible when we stand together against injustice. Now, let's show the world what we can build together." As applause erupted, Samuel turned to embrace his family. They had been through so much, but their love for each other and their community had never wavered. Together, they had not only survived, but had become catalysts for change. The sun set on Millbrook, casting a warm glow over the town. The shadows of the past were still there, but they no longer held the power they once did. In their place was a growing light of understanding, compassion, and hope for a more just future. And so, the story of the Johnsons, a tale that began with an unjust arrest, became a testament to the enduring power of truth, perseverance, and the unbreakable bonds of family and community. Their journey, though fraught with challenges, had indeed shocked the world, not with tragedy, but with the triumph of the human spirit and the promise of positive change.